We developed this idea of intergenerational leadership. What does it mean to have leadership that is shared across different generations? Because there's the younger generation who has a way of seeing the world, has maybe less experience in years, but has experience maybe in new technologies and new ways of seeing the world. There's the older generation that has a lot of experience, but may not have the same capacity, the same kind of stamina. Those people in the middle that are somewhere in between it. So how do you build a stewardship circle or a leadership circle, call it what you may, that really allows everyone to be within their capacity, within their experience, within their desires, within their hopes?
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Oren Slozberg. Oren is the Executive Director at Commonweal. Commonweal is a fascinating community nonprofit that hosts a range of initiatives around healing, arts, environment, and justice. I find Oren so eloquent and wise. In this comprehensive discussion, we talk about what is Commonweal and its unique structure and history. We go into the Polycrisis, the convergence of crises, and resilience. We discuss justice and privilege, intergenerational leadership and succession, religion and our relationship to death. Oren has a wealth of experience around retreat centers and land projects, and what he refers to as communities of refugia. He also has a lot of experience around philanthropy, so we discuss trends that he's seen in that space. And I love how he frames a willingness to understand money differently. I really appreciate Oren for sitting down with me. This conversation happened in San Francisco, April 2023. Let's dive in. Oren Slozberg. We're here with Oren Slozberg. Oren is the Executive Director at Commonweal. How you doing, Oren?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Sure.
So what is Commonweal?
You don't have any easier questions? Start with that one. Commonweal is somewhere between a community of people that do good work in the world, nonprofit, and what feels almost like a vision to heal the world and heal ourselves. We don't have a mission per se, but we do have a belief that there are good people who are doing good work in the world, and it's our responsibility to support them in what they do. So while we are a 501c3, we have almost 35 different programs in a lot of different areas. So there's not one specific focus. So it goes a little against the kind of conventional nonprofit mantra of find your mission, focus, and only do that, and bringing together people from different areas. So we started in working in the area of supporting people with cancer. And we have a retreat center in Bolinas where people come for a week and they're held at that moment of transformation. So when you get a cancer diagnosis, everything around you changes. People treat you differently. Like some friends who you think would be there are not there, and some people who you didn't expect to be there will show up. You suddenly have to learn how to cook better. You have to exercise. You have to meditate. You have to become an oncologist, so you choose what kind of treatment that you want. And there's this major transformation that happens with the diagnosis. And what the Cancer Help Program does, it holds them during that week. There's no prescription. It's like, don't do this or do that. That's not what happened. It's really about enabling that to support that transformation. At the same time, so you're asking questions of life and death. Because when you have a cancer diagnosis, it could mean that you'll get a prognosis for some amount of time. So how do you hold that? How do you hold the pain and suffering as to where you are? So that's kind of the root of Commonweal. If you imagine it as a tree, that's kind of like the main trunk. And that holds all the different bodies of work that we do. So we have a concentration in the area of health and healing. So from the cancer work, we spun off into doing circles for people that are dealing with different challenges. A lot of them people with cancer. And following the pandemic, that spread around the world. So I lose track of how many countries, but it's probably in at least 20 different countries in most of the states. And that would be our Healing Circles program. And out of Healing Circles program grew, how do we support nurses that are dealing with stress while working in medical institutions during the pandemic? So you can kind of see how this tree branches. So that's like the health and healing in cancer. Or a website that is probably the best depository of information around integrative medicine and cancer.
Integrative medicine?
And cancer, yeah.
And cancer,
so like when you have cancer and your neighbor comes up to you and tells you about their dog walker's mother's neighbor's cat owner who tried this very special supplement and their life has changed. And you're like, maybe I'll look into that. So if you go to cancerchoices.org, you could actually look into that, and all the supplements and all the treatments out there, which is a combination both of supplements or medication that is no longer in use or medication that's out of patent. There's a lot of old medications that actually do really good work, but because they become generic, they don't get recommended as much. So you need to have that kind of place, and you can track how from Cancer Hill program through work with nutrition and working with exercise and healing circles. Now we have Cancer Choices. So there's this natural evolution. And each one of those programs are independent, and they have a program director. They're kind of like they're basically an executive director. So their responsibility is to hold the mission, to hold the work of their specific program, to raise the funds. And then Commonweal is like the container that holds all of these different programs. So a bunch of our work is in the area of health and healing and cancer and integrative medicine. We have a whole body of work in the area of environment and justice. So our juvenile justice program has been running for, I think David's been with us for almost 25 years. And he was part of the team that closed the California youth prison. So now young people in California are no longer sent to a prison elsewhere, but stay in their communities with the community and social services support, we hope. So Commonweal's been involved in that. We work with first responders that are putting out fires, who are now breathing our burning homes and forests and have probably 6 times the rate of cancer because of what they're breathing. So there's a research component. So I'm not trying to brag. What I'm trying to demonstrate is the complexity of the organization that is all rooted in one place. So our work in justice also involves a leadership training for BIPOC leaders in Southern California, or retreats for Black women that are in leadership positions in their community that need to get away. So we have this whole area of work of environment and justice. Our third body of work is in the area of education and the arts. So there's a permaculture center. It's a program that works with art museums across the world called Visual Thinking Strategies. It's a series of summer camps. And the reason what makes sense for all of this to be in the same place is that, one, there's shared values about doing good work in the world, but also the state of the world as it is now. We have this confluence of all these different stressors. So we have this very complex next 50 years. We think a lot about climate, which is one of the big crises, and that really tends to dominate how we look at where the world is. But the ocean is being acidified, and we're losing marine life. Or in many places, because of agriculture or changes in weather patterns, you're seeing the loss of topsoil. You're seeing that the sperm count among men has been dropping dramatically since the 1950s, the rise of different toxins in the environment. And you see the parallels in social structures, cultural structures, economic structures. We're seeing how wealth is being more concentrated. We're seeing the rise in populism, the rise in fascism. So even if tomorrow we would stop all the causes of climate change, we'll still be in this predicament where we have existential threats to what our planet looks like. And that complexity is not going to be addressed by scientists alone, or by politicians on their own, or by faith communities, or by artists, or by any of the institutions that we've inherited, there needs to be an approach that is more complex. So how do you get all those voices in the room? So what is underlying this Commonweal community, this complex community, is this idea. It's like, let's get people from all these different areas, all these different sectors together to have the conversation. We're not, a solution is not going to happen. This isn't a Band-Aid that you can't put a cast on the planet and everything will be fine. This is going to require healing. And there's a difference between healing and curing. That's one of the things we talk about with in the Cancer Help Program. We're not here to cure the cancer. A lot of people are going to be living with their cancer for a long time. We're about healing who we are. So when we look at the plan, it's like, in any of our lifetimes, including the baby who's born today, they're not going to see the cured planet. That's just not going to happen in the next 150 years. But we can see a movement towards healing, which is a different stance that requires a more complex conversation to deal with the more complex issues. So Commonweal has this, we're kind of the container that holds all these programs. And the Polycrisis is kind of something that we all hold together. So hoping that the conversations that we're going to have, that any initiatives that come out of it, collaborative initiatives, would be able to address the complexity. I mean, the biggest challenge is, it's like, how do you even think about it?
Right. So what I hear you saying is Commonweal is an unconventional nonprofit organization, community type of structure that holds a number of different programs. And if we imagine a tree at the trunk was really, it came out of end-of-life cancer treatment care, and that there's these threads of healing and this emphasis on healing. And when you follow healing, you also end up in places like nurses affected by COVID or firefighters affected, disproportionately because of the toxins that they're breathing in. But that it's not that you're just saying yes to all of these things haphazardly. It's actually held by this recognition that we live in a context where problems are complex. And so if we don't actually bring different stakeholders and sit with lots of the different interconnections of the challenges, and we only isolate ourselves into one particular piece, then maybe we're not giving fullness to the healing that we're embarking on.
Yeah, next time I'll ask you, you can answer in 2 minutes instead of 20.
Well, it helps that I've been there a couple of times and that we've had this conversation. So I'd love to ask a couple more questions just to help root listeners, and we'll also put links in the show notes to these different programs as you mentioned them. But so there's very much a place-based context. Can you also talk a bit about the duration, the founding story, like how long has Commonweal been around, and help people get a sense of how many people are involved and that sort of thing?
So the origin story, so to speak, is Michael Lerner, who was grew up on the East Coast and was got his PhD at Harvard and was at a joint appointment to the medical school and the business school at Yale. Imagine 1960s, what's happening on the East Coast, what's happening in the Bay Area. He was fascinated by what's happening in the Bay Area, so he comes out here and he hears about a young woman whose life was turned around when her diet was changed. They thought that she was learning disadvantage, that she couldn't study, and that she would never succeed. She'd have to be in a home. And then they changed her diet, and something happened. So imagine somebody who is gluten intolerant or is allergic to peanuts. In the early 70s, there wasn't as much awareness of it, right? So if they're getting peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, yes, they cannot study. So there was like this aha moment, okay, so nutrition can really make a difference in how we learn. And for us right now, it's like, duh. It's like every restaurant you go to, there's like this array of what are your allergies. That consciousness didn't exist then. So Michael, together with a few other people, created a school called the Full Circle School, founded it in 1973 in Bolinas, which is about an hour north of San Francisco on the coast, which was a little hippie village. It had a reputation at the time of wanting to keep people out by stealing the signs. The hippies kind of took over about that time, and they passed a moratorium on new construction because of a limited water supply. So there's this little community, and Michael with a few friends succeeded in buying a piece of land, and they built a barn to house a school for young people that they found in the juvenile justice system that they would bring to Bolinas and live kind of in a group home setting and turn their life around by changing their nutrition and providing group support. So that was the first step that Michael took. And he was living with Carolyn Brown, who was, I think she was a child psychologist or a social worker who was living in Bolinas and living in her garage in Bolinas. And he was walking along one of the many roads. And on the other side of this cow pasture, there's an old building that was built in the 1920s by RCA. It's one of the first radio stations in the world. And you kind of imagine Michael probably in his early 30s, and Bolinas, which is often foggy, like it's kind of like the sunset in San Francisco, kind of eternal fog with once in a while a ray of sun comes through. So that ray of sun, like in an old Renaissance painting, comes down and lights up this old Art Deco building from 50 years before his time. And he got this message of, this is a place to build a center for both healing ourselves and healing the planet. And being in his early 30s, he didn't know what he didn't know. So he calls up RCA, which owned the building, and said, how about you give us this space? Because he knew they were in the process of closing down. And they said, no, but we'll sell it to you for 1 point something million. As a 30-year-old, he did not have 1 point something million, but together with another local activist, Per Henneman, they started working to gather the resources. Make the story short, the Trust for Public Land ended up buying it from, I shouldn't say from underneath them, but basically they had the resources, they bought the land, and they signed a lease with Commonweal for 50 years. They then donated the land to the National Park Service, so Point Reyes National Seashore. So right now we're in that same building, and the federal government is our landlord. A little bit of an absentee landlord, but they're...
You probably prefer it that way.
But you know, it's really interesting to see how we're such good friends. The previous superintendent of the park and the current one would probably say it as well, but Cicely Muldoon, who's now the superintendent of Yosemite, would say that Commonweal is one of the best examples of a public-private partnership because we steward the land, we restore these historical buildings, and our work so much reflect the mission of the park.
Right.
So Commonweal as a private entity, because it is a nonprofit organization, so it's considered private, and the government public goals, they align perfectly well. So it's this very sweet partnership. Back in 1979, Commonweal's first iteration was as a clinic, an integrated medicine clinic for West Marin, or I think all of Marin County. I wasn't around then. I was 12. So... And then when it was funded by the federal government, Ronald Reagan came into power, closed down all the programs. So it went from a staff of 40 to a staff of 2. At the same time, Michael's father got cancer. His wife left him. His dog died. Imagine the country song. So he went on a journey. He discovered integrative medicine. He came back and he started the Cancer Hope Program with the support of his mentor, Phil Lee, who was the chancellor of the UC system. He received the MacArthur Genius Award that helped fund Commonweal at the beginning because of his work in integrative medicine. And that was in 1989. So that was it might have been 86. So that's when this iteration of Commonweal started. They started with the Cancer Hope Program. From that, the tree grew to where it is today. Today, Commonweal is about 30 to 35 programs. It's not that I don't know the number, but some of the programs, we have healing circles in Houston and we have healing circles in Europe, and there's 2 programs or 1 program. I'm not really obsessed with having a rigid structure that we need to define things, but it's in the area to 30 to 40 programs. We probably have a staff of over 100 people, of which a quarter of them are based in Bolinas, but the rest of them are throughout the United States, some working virtually, some working at other offices, depending on the programs. The organizational structure is definitely not your typical pyramid where you have like board, executive director, management team, and staff. But if you think about that tree that I described, if you look at it from above, what you see is all the programs. So really what the org chart looks like is more like a menorah, like a candelabra with these 30 programs, each one of them at the head of what they do. And our role is to support that and be the container, weave it together, have the conversations about the Polycrisis. So we have a stewardship circle of 6 people that is diverse in terms of who's there, in terms of gender and race. It ranges from 39 to 79. And the stewardship circle holds this whole candelabra. It's kind of the foundation with the support of the board and our administrative and finance teams.
Got it. And when did your journey with Commonweal begin?
My journey with Bolinas started in 1988 when I moved to the Bay Area and fell in love with it and so wanted to live in Bolinas.
Where were you from before?
I grew up in Israel, faraway country on the other side of the planet, which I escaped when I was younger for many reasons, but partially I was coming out. So it was not the place I wanted to come out, and because my mom grew up in Los Angeles, it was easy for me to move here. And I moved to Northern California and discovered Bolinas and always wanted to live there, but there's no jobs in Bolinas. And there was no telecommuting in the 80s. But after working in the queer community and in doing youth development, and then for a while I worked with fine art museums and education, I met Michael Lerner, the guy who walked along the beach and saw the racing. Yeah. I did a presentation about the work I was used to do, and he was looking for an executive director. He had just turned 70, was about to turn 70. And we started walking together, and at some point he said, well, do you want to, I'm looking for an executive director. And I said, I don't want to be an executive director under a legendary founder, but I'll be happy to work with you. So we created the position of Chief Strategies Officer. And I started working at Commonweal, and then 5 years later, when Michael turned 75, we thought it's time for him to move to the role of board chair. And I became executive director, and we developed this idea of intergenerational leadership. What does it mean to have leadership that is shared across different generations? Because there's the younger generation who has a way of seeing the world, has maybe less experience in years, but has experience maybe in new technologies and new ways of seeing the world. There's the older generation that has a lot of experience, but may not have the same capacity, the same kind of stamina. Those people in the middle that are somewhere in between it. So how do you build a stewardship circle or a leadership circle, call it what you may, that really allows everyone to be within their capacity, within their experience, within their desires, within their hopes? So the intergenerational leadership model is one where there are jobs, titles, so to speak. Not so to speak, there are job titles, but the lines between the jobs move. So as Michael may be more interested right now, so he's focusing on the Polycrisis. So our COO is now picking up more of his cancer work. So the boundaries between them are fluid, so that it allows each of us to be where we need to be, and we're not locked into a position because that is my title.
It's so interesting because I have interacted with a number of nonprofit organizations that are founder or founders led in their 70s. And the question is always around succession, hiring the next generation of executive director talent. And in board conversations that I've been privy to in different NGO contexts, there's usually an emphasis on gender or racial diversity at the board table. But I don't feel like this conversation around intergenerational diversity and representation is necessarily as held. I mean, I think in the climate space, there's a bit of like, I hear more conversations about like, well, should we have a young person in our stewardship circle or a young person represented as an advisor or something like that? But like, it's almost like we're skipping a few generations, going all the way down, like have 12-year-olds tell us what they think, right?
They have to have a bar mitzvah first, so 13 and above.
13 and above. So yeah, I guess any other thoughts on that, or does that match your observations of other
where the
organizations?
intergenerational leadership model came from was Michael and I were driving together and the conversation about succession started. I'm like, really, succession? I mean, like, what are the royal family? You have to wait the queen to die so her son can be king. It's like it's like what? It's like suddenly there's a moment in which you're useless and you've been useful your entire life.
Here's the baton. Okay, I'm out. Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, and we've seen how much drama happens. I mean, I experience it myself. Like, and I've been both a founder and worked with founders. There's, we could write novels around founder syndromes. They'd be like horror films. Because there is this idea like, okay, so your time is up, now someone else takes over. It doesn't make sense. So how do you create the structure that allows for it to happen? Now, when I came to Commonweal, I was worried about that. This is why I never took the ED role. But once I got to know Michael, he's exceptional at who he is. And part of it, he has this ability to detach. I'm like, okay, I can detach and let go of that. And he really can. Now, we all have egos. No one is egoless, but if you keep it in check, then you can really allow everybody to maximize their abilities and learning opportunities. I feel like I'm learning from him all the time. And like we have people younger in our organization that are also part of that dynamic. So you move this idea of succession, you move this idea of passing the baton. We are not relay racers, and we are not King Charles, who waited God knows how long. Where it's about building partnerships. But this comes back to the idea around the polycrisis. Like, to deal with the polycrisis being the global issue that it is, we can't segment ourselves. It's not like, we talked about the different professions. It's not that progressives can solve the polycrisis on their own. They may have the solutions, not that there is a solution, but they may think, we would like to believe there's things that we can do to mitigate. But it's going to take a community-wide effort, whether we like it or not. You're going to have to end up sitting with other people, and that includes generations as well. The generation that messed things up, the generation that didn't take care of things, the generation that thinks they know the answers, like all those.
This has been our banter. I'm like, you guys messed it up. You're like, you think you know everything.
We all know nothing. We can settle on that. But that's what's going to happen, right? We still have power differentials. Wealth is not distributed equally. There's justice is, I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, but sometimes it feels like that. So we're dealing with this, but in order to proceed on any of these, it's going to require really, how do you bring more people to the table? Not sure at the table, but so like back to this idea of like, how do you do this intergenerational work? I think it's critical. I don't think there's a moment when one generation can check out. Definitely not if you're blaming them, if it's their fault they can't check out. So like really thinking about how do you build these, they're even more than partnerships. I'm a little bit at a loss what the right word would be, but there has to be really
allyship or alliance,
and it has to be deep and sincere, and recognize that each generation does have its own shtick.
So, I mean, the longevity of your role at Commonweal somewhat proves the case that you've made it work with Michael. You're both still involved in the organization. So you've been there well over 20 years now.
No.
Over 30
10
years. 10 years. Sorry, I got my dates wrong. So you said 88.
88 is when I moved to the Bay Area. I started at Commonweal at 2013.
Okay. I didn't mean to. Yeah. So 20 years.
Yes. Yeah. 10 years. 2013 was 10 years ago.
Oh, okay. Who's good at math?
It's okay,
not
math.
Me.
It's a generational thing.
All right. We won't edit that out. My very embarrassing math. So, the average ED role, I think, is 2 years in the nonprofit space. It's one of the highest turnover positions.
Especially following a founder.
And especially following a founder. I remember when I was going through my first CEO succession in startup land, I was told that, roughly half of these work, if you're lucky.
Right.
Passing on that type of leadership position to the next is just enormously tricky.
Right.
And, I have also had personal experience in multiple organizations now in those transitions. And I noticed there's all sorts of, there's like a psychological minefield of ego that I certainly, have experienced for myself, and I think others as well. And so, any other reflections on the qualities or the skills that you've learned or had to learn the hard way to really making it work, both within this intergenerational context as well as the shadow of a legendary founder, Michael Lerner, and any other practices that you all embark on to really make this sustain?
There's a few things there. One, there are qualities that founders have that enable them to be the torchbearers, right? The person who has a new idea, a new approach, a new philosophy. It takes a certain personality type to go out into the world and say, you people are not doing it right, or I have an idea that's going to disrupt what you're doing, right? It's a certain charismatic person that has the ego to withstand it, because when you're coming up with a disruptive idea, you're going to have many people who don't want to be disrupted.
Right.
So that is almost the same quality that makes it harder for someone to take over, because it's someone who's strong and confident. I mean, obviously there's variations, there's people that work in different ways, but that is a quality that makes sometimes the founder transition harder. And there was something unique about Michael, which is why it took me 5 years to agree to do it. It's like, okay, he is different. And it's something about being able to be aware of who you are and how you carry that torch. I don't know if this is true. This would be a good question to ask him. It's like, I met him, 25 years after he'd been leading 6 retreats a year with people with cancer. And I think that when you work with people at end of life, you start to reflect on what's really important, like the things that we deem really important. Everybody has their own story. When you're in the company of someone who's asking questions of life and death, it's like they want to focus in. It's like, this is what I want. My family is important to me. Living another day is important for me. Taking care of my health is, or finishing my book, or visiting Machu Picchu. But there's a certain focus that comes when, and if it's
so
held
clarifying.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
If it's held right, because end of life can also create panic and stress and depression. But if it's held right, you see that happening. And if you're in the circle where that is happening, I think you really learn to put your ego in check. So that's my theory. It would be interesting to hear what Michael would say. But I think that's what allowed him to give space. And we've been doing this kind of transition to this intergenerational model over 10 years. And we make mistakes. We step on each other's toes sometimes. But we also developed the capacity I can say, Michael, you really shouldn't have done that. Or he'll say, Oren, you stepped on my toes, or so to speak. So we've been able to develop this kind of relationship that allows that to happen. So when friends, let's say of my generation, who are going through these issues, because a lot of these organizations were set up in the 1970s and 80s, and a lot of those people are now in their 80s and 90s. So my generation of people in their 50s and the 60s tend to be the next in line. So it's not one size fits all. This worked for Commonweal because of who we are and the work that we do. I could imagine ways in how other people can use this consciousness, and it might be useful, and for some it may not be useful. There's some organizations where the founder really needs to leave because how things were 20 years ago is not how it is now. And if you can't let go of 1985, you're not going to succeed in 2005, or I guess 2003 and 2023.
I'm glad I'm not the only one struggling with math today.
It's a hot day in San Francisco. It's very unusual. Math has its own version.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'd love to shift into polycrisis. You said the word a few times. Maybe you can start with how you define it, or experience that definition, and then dive in from there.
Polycrisis is what follows polyamory. Sorry.
It's perfect. Like I told you, my current feedback from our camera crew is I'm being too earnest with this interview series. So you're here to help me buck the trend.
There's so many words for the polycrisis. I find myself changing how I define it all the time, which is okay. I don't think there's one uniform way of doing it. And as you can see from Commonweal structure, I'm not really buying into having a fixed definition. But the idea that there is a convergence of global challenges that are facing us right now, this is not a future thing. This is happening already. It is not distributed equally across the globe. And the impact is felt differently across the globe. There are places that once the fire goes through your town, you can rebuild. I live in Sonoma County. We had a whole neighborhood lost to fire. It's now rebuilt. There are other places around the world when the fire goes through, that's done. And everybody has to migrate away. So how it's distributed and where it's distributed is not equal. But there are definitely challenges that we're going through right now. Some of them are created by us, others may not be, but the reality of it is that it's here. But there are all these vectors that are challenging humanity, and they're in the context of a world that is changing. The U.S. hegemony is changing. Is that a good or bad thing? That's a different kind of question. There are other countries that are coming into economic power or political power or military power. It's within the context of how the global South is actually brown and black people throughout the globe are probably feeling more of the impact of the stressors that were caused by people who live in the global North. So the polycrisis is just a word to recognize that there are all these different crises. And you could look at it as one big one. Some people like the word meta-crisis. I like the polycrisis because it really articulates the fact that there are many vectors. There are many different existential challenges.
Yeah, the crypto community right now, there's a lot more talk of the frame meta-crisis. And I guess for people listening, they can be somewhat interchangeably used, although I experienced the conversation around meta-crisis a bit more like, there's common patterns of coordination failure and zero-sum games and game theoretics that it underpins a lot of these different crises. Right. And, implicit in that, like maybe if we can fix that, we can fix all of these downstream, problems. And I guess I resonate more with polycrisis in that there's a plurality of things, and maybe it's a little too easy to try to say that like we just pull one thing and it's going to solve all of them. Like these are actually still need to be experienced in somewhat their uniqueness.
Right, and they're interconnected in complex ways.
Right.
I mean, we love to think, there's that story about how do you use a pebble to change the course of a river. It's like there is a point where you could put a pebble and maybe the water would go in a different direction. The whole river eventually would go in a different way.
Right.
But I think we're in a place that there are so many different streams coming into the rivers that you would need many pebbles, and then it's no longer one. But I get the meta-crisis, and it's not a bad analysis, especially if you're talking about how human life, human engagement have changed the whole thing.
Yeah.
Joanna Macy talks about the Great Turning. I like that as well. So it's not, the focus is not on crisis, but focus on the change that is happening. Some of it is crisis induced, some of it may be cultural evolution. There could be different ways of looking at it.
Yeah. And I guess, I don't know if it's just the waters that I swim in, but I felt frustrated 5 years ago, 10 years ago by the narrative, the Steven Pinker, like everything's getting better. Violence is down. This is just a gradual line of progress up and to the right. And, we're becoming more peaceful. We're living longer. Child mortality is down. Like all you doomsdayer, apocalyptic, climate change, worrying folks, like, and now it feels like the narrative is like a little bit more, I don't know if this is just my bias, but like a little bit more like there's a widespread recognition, maybe because of the pandemic, maybe because of the severity of the climate situation, where maybe because of AI, like just like hitting us like all of a sudden, that maybe that rhetoric that just things are just, it's all roses and that we're just moving up into the right in this line of progress, that actually we are in important moment, and it is precarious.
There's different ways to look at that. I mean, the basic answer, well, at least one thought is, I was reading Commanding Hope by Thomas Homer Dixon, and he brought, I don't remember who he quoted, though I should find out and get it to you. He talks about, so if there's a potential impending disaster ahead of you, you can say, no, things are looking great, fine, and not do anything, or you do something about it. So what are your choices? Either you're an optimist, and if you're right, and everything and nothing happens, you're in good shape. If you're wrong, you're screwed. If you say, okay, I think there's this impending disaster, if you're wrong, you're in good shape. If you're right, then you're well prepared. So if there's something ahead of you that is at this level, and we all know that something is happening, I would say, let's think about resilience. Let's think what we can do in our community. So that's just one pragmatic, logical exercise, which you can break down, of
course.
I
think, too, there's a discussion about justice and privilege here. Like people who take that frame are often starting implicitly like everything's okay right now.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people on this planet, that's not their frame.
For most people on this planet.
For most people on this planet, right? And so to suggest that like, there's some things that we're evolving from our problematic history as humans, but it's all going to gradually get better and better, I think is it feels like it's not rooted enough in the felt sense of what's happening on the planet from my vantage point.
And what's the underlying story that you're talking about? Right. So people in Israel say, the Palestinians have a higher standard of living than other Arabs in other countries, which I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's really hiding the reality of there's an oppressed community, whether they're living higher level standard of living is better or not, right? Or are you talking about, countries who are being electrified like getting electricity? It's like, well, the West got its electricity 100 years ago from fossil fuel and coals. So it's like, so now the rest of the world is going to be electrified. It's just fair. So there's different ways in how you look at it. And I think one's underlying values are really the question that you're asking. If you're looking for a world in which the capitalist system that supported the U.S. to be what it is today is now perpetuating in other places, and you think that's a good thing, well, okay, that might be a lens to look at it. There might be other lenses we look at. It's like, what is happening to the environment around the world? So when you are building more coal factories in countries that want to bring electricity to their people, which is a good thing, what are the consequences of that? And there's no straight answer. I mean, it's like, who are we to say you may do this or you may not do? It's like we polluted the planet for 100 years and now we can tell you not to do it. Right? You should not have electricity because it's now polluting the planet. So there's different lens of how you might look on it. And I think the optimistic worldview, there's a need to have a conversation to really see what underpins it. Are people living longer? In some places they are. In many places they are. Are people having smaller families? Are there less people in poverty? Is literacy more common? Yes. But what else is going on? There's like the seeing the totality of it, and
it gets back to, I guess, what you said. Like, there's nuance and complexity here, right? Like, it's not just one simplified answer. And so if we sit with the discomfort and the many different stakeholders and we hear the different lenses and perspectives, is implied in that we need to kind of slow down to kind of feel more of the wholeness of the inquiries that we hold?
Well, this is a question that puzzles me a lot, which is that when we talk about the polycrisis, holding it is complex because it really is, it's a big system, right? So you have to be in almost this metacognitive stance in order to hold it without just saying, this is the one thing I need to address, or I have my car, I have my house, now I'm happy, or I have a source of food. So how do you find that point of view that allows to hold that complexity? And that's where I think one of our biggest challenges is like, how do we do that? Because if I live in Sonoma County, okay, there's a fire once in a while, but it's kind of beautiful there. Our well produces water. We have vegetables in our garden. I could look at my little island and say, okay, this seems to be okay. Okay, so there is climate change once in a while, but I can deal with it. I can deal with it for now. It's harder to hold the totality of it. Not that anybody really can. I mean, I think it's almost a mental exercise. It reminds me when I was, before I came to Commonweal, I worked with fine art museums. And part of the strategy I was teaching was, how do you make meaning out of art? And it was fascinating being at, let's take San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And you take a painting by something figurative. I think there's a Diego Rivera painting called The Flower Bearer or Flower Carer. And you can have 15 people have different ways of saying the same thing. Some people will see this, oh yeah, he picked all these flowers because he's going to go married. And other people will say he's a day laborer that's carrying it. And some people say those aren't his flowers. So there's all these single ways of seeing things. But the more you talk about art together, the more people can stand in this metacognitive stance and be able to reflect on how they make meaning and how they think and how they can see the complexity in things. And that's one of the questions I have around the Polycrisis, like how do we bring ourselves to be able to even hold it? So that's one aspect of it, is the complexity of it. The other one is the direness of it. It's like, this is more in the cancer realm. It's like, how do you hold the fact that you received a diagnosis that there's something is going to happen? How do you hold that which might mean death? How do you hold that? The Polycrisis creates that stance as well, because I'm always hesitant to say like the Polycrisis is the cancer of the planet. For one, it simplifies things to like one thing. But just for the sake of the analogy, when you have cancer, one of the ways to hold it is by looking at it and recognizing, staring at it, not averting your eyes, not putting your head in the sand, not pretending, oh, well, 20% of people live for 20 years. It's like recognizing what it is and being then able to decide or live the way you want to with that awareness. The Polycrisis is some way the same way. It's like we are at this state. It's like, you could be the eternal optimist or not. It is what it is, right? The Orange Day that was here in San Francisco was super real. And I don't think anybody had seen anything like that before, right? The way that the desert in the tropics is growing, or in Saharan Africa, it's like, that is real. The migration of people along the border, that is very real. So whether you want to discuss it or not, it's like, we need to be able to hold it and to be true. It's like you take the migration question, it's like, there's a lot of migrant refugees right now. There's going to be more, as there's more drought, as there's more violence. There's going to be more people on the borders of countries that are deemed safer. What's going to happen?
Right.
What is the capacity of one country to take on people from another country? Who has the right? So there's a need to be able to kind of, who would mind to say, what do I know? But it's like, you need to at least look at it and recognize it,
right,
so that you can then have the capacity to try and make meaning out of it and then make decisions about who you are, what you're going to do, and so on.
So what I hear you saying is that there's kind of the importance of facing reality is kind of step one. When someone goes through the cancer program out the other side, or goes through a conversation at Commonweal, or maybe your own experience of this, like, what does a healthy metabolizing these conversations and then getting to that next state look like? Is it, filled with humor and joy, able to take action? I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to enjoy the last moments of my life. And I've processed the grief. Or is it, I'm curious, what does, in your mind, a more healthy version or expression look like?
I don't know if there's a one-size-fit-all. We hear stories about people that have diagnosis, and that's when they decide to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. There's people that just want to spend the rest of their life with their family. I'm not sure I wish it was that easy.
Right.
I know that not falling into despair and depression to allow you to do what you want to do is probably something that I would consider successful or healthy. Being able to see clearly how your path is. You could go as far as like choosing how you want to die. I think those are all part of it. We all have different types. We have different worldviews. We see the world in different ways. Our relationships are different. The love that we carry manifests in different ways. So if you're at a place where the fear of death doesn't dominate how you live your last few months, I think that is a different place to be in. There's interesting studies going on about how psychedelics might be able to facilitate that moment between prognosis and end of life. And it's interesting, not to speak specifically about the psychedelics, but it's like, what is it that's shifting? What is it in our way of seeing the world shifts that allow us to enter this in the way that we would like to? Nobody wants to live in I am in despair, in depression, in fear. It's like you want to hold it the way you want to. And the planet is not, well, depends who you talk to. Some people say the planet is dying, others people will say the planet will be okay. Some people think humans will go extinct. I don't know. I really don't know. So it's not exactly, this is where the analogy falls down.
Yeah.
But the ability to say, okay, so this is happening, what do we need to adjust in our worldview, to create the kind of world we want? So Michael talks about how we're going through a funnel right now, and we're not sure what's going to come out the other side of it. We know there's going to be a lot less species, right? That's already, there's this mass extinction going on.
Right.
There is a good chance that a lot of people will die and suffer. So maybe what we're supposed to do now, so the kind of the parallel to kind of the prognosis is, what can we do today to prepare the world that we would like to see? How do we try to create the world on the other side that is more just, that is more just to each other as humans and more just to the planet and its species? Sometimes I think that that's what Commonweal's role is, because we don't know how, where, and why the Polycrisis will unfold. We have ideas. We're seeing it as it's happening. But it's hard to say when is that going to happen. And it's not clear what will be needed. So I think sometimes what Commonweal does with all of its variety of conversations is basically creating the soil for these seeds that will emerge when they need to. So it's like, what do we learn about healing? What does permaculture teach us? What does it mean to look at life and death? What does it mean to look at our environment? So there's this, it's like, there's a term I learned from Adam Horowitz, who started Nuns and Nuns, called refugia. So when a fire goes through a forest, you have these islands of trees that survive. And I saw this in Sonoma County. It's like, it feels almost random. And when you read about it, there's not a clear scientific explanation to why it happens, but de facto what happens, this is where the seeds are, this is where the wildlife is. So when the forest regenerates, a refugia becomes kind of that source from where, nature restores itself.
Right.
And I'm hoping that could be a little bit of the concept of what Commonweal is doing, is building this community to build these capacities, so what comes out on the other side of the tunnel is a more just world. And just, once again, across all the dimensions, both among humans in nature, among races, among genders. It's like, the world will be changing. The world changes all the time. Kind of, you asked before, is this more dramatic change? Yes, I think this is a more dramatic times of changes. So what can we do today to really shape a better world for tomorrow? So by doing the work that we do in a lot of spaces, I think is part of it. Part of that also means that we ask ourselves the question, what do we need to do to be the refugia? Sometimes in the physical sense, like
totally
set up a microgrid. The power could go down. We have power shutoffs all the time, but it could go down for longer. What is your water source? Where is your food coming from? When we talk about, so what do you do about what can I do today? It's like, well, I think think radically local.
Yeah.
Who is your community? Because if the cell phone network isn't working as well, the fact that you have friends thousands of miles away is not going to help you tomorrow. So what is the systems that you live in? Do you know where your water comes from? Do you know where your food comes from? We may never need to know that, but I also think that awareness, if we know where it comes from, will also change how we live. Right. Being more conscious of our use of resources, being more aware, who are the people that we don't see when we drive to work? Who do we choose to see? So starting to think in a radically local way, I think, is going to make a difference. If the optimists are right and nothing's going to happen, we're still in better shape because we did it.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, in the kind of land project lens, whether it's in the eco-villages or retreat centers or bioregional land projects, farms, etc. Yeah, I mean, like I remember when Gigi Coyle used the frame, like what we're doing is we're creating these watering holes right now. You know, these, some call them the islands of sanity, like these little bastions of refuge where, you know, the seeds of tomorrow start today. And, you know, we need to pattern and learn and do the work of what do holistic, well-functioning, regenerative communities that are in right relationship with each other and the land look like. And even though that's not a mainstream concept right now, that's where we're headed.
Yeah, and it might happen. One of Commonweal's programs that we started with a few other retreat centers and the Fetzer Institute is the Retreat Center Collaboration, which is, I'm not sure, I think there's like 2,000 retreat centers in the U.S. About 200 of them gather in different ways with the Retreat Center Collaboration, and each one of those could be a watering hole. And if you layer on top of it Paul Hawkins' blessed unrest of thinking of each organization being the country's immune system. So you're seeing a lot of T cells out there that potentially can make a difference. One of the questions we asked with the Retreat Center Collaboration is, how does each one of these retreat centers become a resilience hub for their community? And resilience is, retreat centers are often in rural settings, serving a metropolitan area that's, I don't know, 2-3 hours away. So if you take Kripalu, which is in Western Mass, it serves Boston and New York. Or you take Kirkridge, which is in the Poconos, most of the people come from New York. But the community around Kirkridge, which is in the Poconos, it's in Bangor, Pennsylvania, they don't look anything like who they're serving in the city. I think it's coal mining country. So how does a retreat center become a resilience hub for its physical community as well as the urban community? And imagine, the 200 retreat centers and the Retreat Center Collaboration, potentially more. How do we start building this immune system? Once again, the refugia. Once again, that funnel. How do we shape the world that's going to come out on the other side of it? And so the Retreat Center Collaboration works in the U.S. and Canada, but these things are happening all over the place. The land-based organizations have a real role. It's different than I'm going to buy 100 acres in Montana and build a bunker for my family and I to hide away from the nuclear fallout. That's not building community. Of course, living with my family in a bunker for a few years, I'm not sure what I would choose. And I love my family. But how do you create these kind of islands, these refugium? There's a way to be intentional about it. So it's intentional communities or communities of faith. In the Mormon world, families are required to have 2 years of emergency supplies. That is just part of what the expectation is. So what can we do to translate that? And once again, if nothing happens for 100 years, that's still great. We still have a more immune world. If something does happen, we're more ready for that.
Yeah. When I moved from the United States to New Zealand, I spent a couple summers traveling quite extensively around the United States and Europe, and I went and visited a number of retreat centers. I was looking through the Global Eco-Village Network and all the different projects that were highlighted and different intentional communities. And my question was, like, what's working, what's not working? And, I think some of the simplistic observations was like, most of these things fail. Like success rate's very small. It's not a new idea to go take a family or small group of people and go move to the land. We're going to live in resilience, eat off the land, et cetera. And the current generation of people alive on this planet, like for as long as we've been living, the reality of the context of our time has made it just very difficult for that model to work. You're either sourcing income from the outside and you're needing that. Land prices are very expensive. Why do I spend all this time and energy growing food when I can go down to the grocery store? And the ones that were working, though, the faith-based elements were very strong in whether it was kind of a spirituality, emphasis or a specific religion, but it was like there was something that united the purpose deep enough where they were able to sustain community conflict. And then I think we also observed, I really was impressed with the elements of when you can build a local food hub, when you can actually have the drumbeat of meals together as a binding agent for a community, small or large, or retreat center. And so, yeah, it's informed a lot of our thinking. Like where I live, we don't have a particular faith. We're very much, open and non-denominational in our approach. But there is that observation that like you want to be continually reinforcing like the deeper why. Right. Like what is driving us and what are we doing this for?
And what is
what's
the deeper why in your community?
Well, I think a lot of it is shaped around how do we live within our bioregion. So rather than having this kind of ring-fenced intentional community, you're in, you're not in, we don't do anything like that. There's no membership, there's no club. What we live amongst people who have lived in this area before us, some of them for 2 years, some of them for 50. And we really see this as, we don't even use the word eco-village or intentional community or anything like that. It's a farm, and we engage around a farm, and we very much are porous within our community and bioregion in terms of if we're going to host an event or if we're going to have food served or whatever, like we're not drawing the boundaries very distinctly of who's in and who's out. Because I think that this get a bunker in Montana is foolish. I think that it's really about these communities of resilience. And so if we're, like I tell people, we want to be able to do the soup kitchen at the local church and serve an abundance of food to communities of people who need it. And if times get really hard, we want to be serving in that kind of capacity and role, not like shut the gate and get the guns and hide out, like that's not going to work if that's the kind of world that we step into. And we're by no means perfect, and we're just kind of still figuring it out. But I think that's how we feel it so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the kind of experimentation that is kind of critical. It's easier to do in a farm in New Zealand than it would be to do in downtown Los Angeles.
100%.
I'm not sure how one would even ask the question, but this is where, it's like, what is it? What is purpose? What is community? What is sense of belonging? Those are very real things.
Yeah.
It also means what is the way that you see the world? That's one of the, having a worldview that is not necessarily one where it's the survival of the tribe.
Right.
As the boundaries between tribes fade, sometimes they're at a country level, sometimes they're at a city level. What is the worldview that we need in order to live in a world that looks different? And I notice there's a trend, including my kids, who think that religion is the source of all evil. And, religion comes from humans. And I wonder if the challenges that religion presents to the world may have been people using faith, maybe, for other purposes. When you think about the teachers, the prophets, if you want to look at the Bible, the Quran, if you want to look at the Hindu traditions, when you look at Buddhism, it's like those original teachers, okay, they're imperfect. We're all radically imperfect. But religions often were sorts of belonging.
Totally.
There's entire communities that survive for hundreds of years because of that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose. And as religion has faded, and I forget how many churches and synagogues close in the U.S. every year, but it's in the thousands. What are we left with? Where does that sense of connection happen? How strong is that connection? And you see these in intentional communities. What is it that holds it together? So I'm cautious about religion. Personally, I'm not. I grew up Jewish. I'm married to a rabbi, but I can't say that I believe blindly into the Torah. Though there's beauty in it. There's a cultural connection, so I can feel that sense of connection with other with other Jews. So
Right.
we're in this in-between space, just as, I wonder if they want to even consider that as a vector in the polycrisis. Kind of the lack of sense
Loss
of belonging,
meaning. Yeah.
loss of purpose.
Yeah.
Religions, what many religions had was a strong social action component. They
Totally.
marked life cycle events. Schools and hospitals, those often came from religious orders. Now, what does it mean that now hospitals are for profits, that schools are seen as factories to produce the workers of tomorrow? How does that change from the old days when this is about, one could say, controlling minds? We're going to indoctrinate you into our religion and how we see the world, or indoctrinate you into the class that we want you to belong to. But there might be an interesting space in between there as we're thinking about like what comes out on the other side of the funnel. What are the new systems? And I think they're about purpose. They're also about what we believe in. They're about faith as much as they are about economic systems. What is the new economic model that won't bring us back to where we are?
Yeah, my brother thinks a lot about this, and we have replaced the church with consumerism and capitalism, and we've replaced churches with high-rise banks, and,
Right.
and like the emphasis that we place on our buildings is a reflection of our culture.
Yeah.
And it is I find it so enriching at this stage in my life when I meet people and get to understand their beliefs and ancestral beliefs and different religions that I wasn't exposed to growing up in the Midwest of the United States. And I think that I personally hold it like that it's all to be welcomed. Like these different beliefs are carrying different messages of wisdom and
Right.
so much value that we don't want to lose in our cultural moment in time, because they can teach us so much, and they can be real signposts.
And separate them a little bit from the institution that goes with them.
Right.
There are certain institutions that certain religions hold on to. As a gay guy, it's like there's a few religions, especially the Judeo-Christian traditions, in which they chose that as a focal point.
Right.
So the institution specifically, this body of law that was created thousands of years ago, aspects of it may not be relevant these days.
Yeah.
But I agree that there's so much there
Yeah.
that we can't survive without.
Right.
I'm not sure what's replacing it.
Can you bring these two conversations together between the retreat centers and religion, and talk a bit about nuns and nuns?
Yeah.
I find it so fascinating, this organization that you've interacted with.
Well, I think Nuns and Nuns kind of exemplifies that. So Nuns and Nuns was started by, God, we'll have to find his name. I think his name is Wayne Mueller. He's a priest. I'm not sure he's Catholic or not. And Adam Horowitz, who is a guy that started an organization called the U.S. Department of Art and Culture. And in their conversations, they started to see resonances between what's happening in the world of Catholic sisters, women religious, and in the world of millennials. So they came up with this name, Nuns and Nuns, Nuns, N-U-N-S, Nuns, sisters, and Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, which is when you ask people of, I'm not sure what generation you are, whatever generation you are.
I'm a late stage millennial.
Okay.
I'm an elder millennial.
You're an elder millennial.
Yeah.
I assume if they were asking you, like, are you,
Right.
Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or none of the above, you might have marked none of the above because your faith or religion is not reflected in any of those institutional or organized religions. So the Nuns and Nuns, this is my understanding. I'm sure if you ask them, they may say it differently. When they started, they saw this resonance between people in their 30s that wanted a life of social justice, of education, of dedication to what's important to them, to the community, and their life. Like, what does it mean to live together? What does it mean to share community, to wake up with morning song? And in some ways, many women religious live that way. There's women that live in cloistered communities and they're kind of separated from the world, but a lot of these women, they blow me away. I mean, they have dedicated their entire life to service in a way that I don't know anything else like it. And because I grew up in Israel and did not interact much with the Christian community, or shall I say, never interacted with the Christian community, I never met a Catholic sister until probably 6-7 years ago. And it was mind-opening to see when you have that sense of belief, when you have that sense of connection, you can say, I am going to dedicate every moment of my life from the moment I get up to the moment that I go to bed, from the day that I join the community till the day I die. That I don't know anything like this, right? This is nonstop, and you give up so much what we perceive in the world, like husbands and families and so on. There's so much. I mean, like, it's not like nuns lock themselves in the convent. I mean, they travel, they have family, they have friends, and so on. But some of the trappings of kind of, let's say, American culture or California culture, if I'll talk what I know about. So the millennials and the sisters found that they're doing the same thing. There was a period even when a group of the nuns and nuns community actually shared space in a convent. And turns out that, there are differences between 80-year-old women and 30-year-old, very diverse group of people. But they do such wonderful work, and the way the work manifests now is really interesting, because some of it is about what can we learn from these communities that survived a long time, right? A lot of these orders were over 100 and something years ago, were created in this country. They created education system, they created hospital systems. But at this stage, there's less and less women who are joining convents.
Right.
That are joining congregations. I'm not sure 100% why, but my guess is that as religion
it's the same story, right?
Yeah. I also think, like in the 60s, if you wanted to run a hospital and you were a woman, many doors would get in the way. If you're a nun, you might be able to take on these responsibilities, take on these roles. So, and there's the question of Vatican II. There's a lot of different variables. The reality is that a lot of these communities are shrinking dramatically, and a lot of them are quite older. I'm not sure what the average age is, but it's somewhere in the mid-80s. So they're going through a transformation, and the nuns and nuns have now become accompaniers to them. So
it's the same intergenerational story back to our earlier part of the conversation.
Skipping the whole middle generation. So part of what nuns and nuns is doing is meeting with sisters and asking the question of land. Because part of what the sisters have built up over the last 100 years is they have their homes, their congregations, their schools. It's like, what's going to happen with that? And what's interesting is that because women are not automatically part of the church, a lot of these communities are actually owning their own land. So most Catholic churches are owned by the Vatican or by the orders, the Benedictine order, the Franciscan, and so on. A lot of these women's spaces are owned by the women themselves, so they get to decide about it. So they can say, we're going to turn our mother house into low-income housing, or they can say, we're going to give this land back to the indigenous community, or we're going to turn it over to Black farmers. And part of what Nuns and Nuns is doing is working with these women at this time of transition. It's such beautiful work. The people that are involved in it, both the sisters and the non-sisters, I wonder what they're called. They're deeply dedicated and doing this with all the values that brought these women to do the work that they were called to do.
Awesome. It reminds me of, there's a beautiful organization called Agrarian Trust, started by Severin Fleming, and they also started organizing a pop-up event. I don't know if it's still happening, called Faithlands, all one word, and we'll put links in the show notes. But it's recognized that, Agrarian Trust was rooted in the recognition that you have something like 400 million acres of farmland changing hands this decade. And this is one of the most transformational shifts in land that's just in the United States, as, again, an intergenerational story of farmers hitting old age, the kids not necessarily wanting to take on the farm. And so you have a huge consolidation happening in the corporate industrial food system. And then you have this young farmers movement of people who absolutely want to go back to the soil and grow food and get out onto the farms, but are unable to because of prices being what they are. And then you also have a justice lens,
Right.
which is this is about land back and reparations and, the long story and lineage of African American people in this country who have been tending the land, but yet don't get to participate in land ownership. And so Faith Lens recognized that there was uniquely this thread of religious organizations and institutions that sit on large tracts of land often don't have to pay property taxes.
That's true.
And so they've had, kind of this compounded benefit and reason to hold on to it and resonate with a vision of more regenerative agricultural practices, more young people tending the land, more of a return to local food systems. And so how do you convene these conversations? Right. I'm probably, like you, not perfectly describing, but
it. We get the gist,
hopefully did that justice to those who are involved in that project. But so, I guess, pulling these threads together between retreat centers, land-based, communities, these different refugia, what else are you seeing, or any other reflections on kind of this transitional moment for land projects?
As you were talking about faith lands, it's like it's those are the things that give one hope. When you hear narratives like that, because in my mind it's like, they're also moving from the major corporate farms to do things that might be smaller, more organic. And then I remember other projects like there's a project in Fresno where they're trying to align the whole food system from the farmer through distribution and the banking system to kind of create a food commons, right? So this is that emergence of that immune system, and those are the kind of things that make me feel hopeful, which is different than feeling optimistic, right? Optimistic is like you think things will work out even though it's kind of clear they won't.
Right.
It's like, I know it's bad, but it'll be okay. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
Hope is the ability to believe that the human soul can adapt and be in the world the way it needs to be. So when you hear about this kind of work, when you hear about the work that nuns are doing, or the retreat center collaboration, I hope some of the work we're doing at Commonweal, or work that's happening in many other organizations, that's what gives me a sense that there is hope. It's not going to be pretty. There's going to be a lot of suffering in the world. It's not going to be distributed equally. It's going to be distributed across lines of access, of wealth, of where you're positioned. But this is the kind of work, together with the justice work that's taking place, together with the economic world, that I think are planting the seeds. There's a lot of experiments with land right now, and when it's approached with caution. I have the voice of in the back of my head that land is actually not something you own. Right. It's kind of, it's land that you steward. You're here for 100 years maybe, but it's like you don't own nothing. Right. So it's like we have that in the back of the mind. How do we integrate that way of thinking, and how do we create systems and institutions and organizations that manifest that relationship to land? We have a woman at Commonweal, Cassandra Ferreira, who started a program called the Center for Ethical Land Transition. Nice. And she's asking that question. So like in this country and many other countries, land transactions are between a buyer and a seller, and it's really an exchange of, I will give you something, you will give me land. And then the whole issue of ownership of land comes in, but it doesn't take into account what the land needs. Right, in the physical sense, and also in the deep soul, the history of the land, what was on this land, what are the stories that this land carries. So imagine that real estate transactions were between the buyer, the seller, and the land. What kind of, what would that look like? And then what does it turn the field of real estate in? So part of what Cassandra's talking about doing is working with realtors to start thinking as well about what else is happening, right? In the capitalist system, we see everything as transactions, from land to relationships, right? When you break up with your wife, who you loved and created a family, you bring in lawyers to separate a contract. It's like, hold on. This is about love. This is about humans. This is about feeling. This is about lineage. It's about so many things. Like, lawyers are the one you want to kind of identify the contract. Actually, there's a Commonweal program called the Integrative Law Institute. that is trying to look at that separately. It's like, how do you decontractualize the relationships that we're turning into legal systems? So maybe instead of, Pauline Tesler was one of the founders of collaborative divorce, where instead of just having two lawyers fighting each other, you have each side has a lawyer, but then you have a psychologist and you have a financial planner. So you're sitting down together to dissolve a relationship. Something brought you together. This is not a contract, right? When you're buying land, it is not just a contract. This is connected to the planet. Anywhere you go on the planet, there are indigenous people that were there.
Right.
So how does that become part of the narrative? This is a little bit trying to shift out of this transactional world, this consumeristic world or capitalist world, choose your phrase. They're transactional. How do we shift to a place where we see the world through different lenses? This is where the worldview has to change.
And you've brought up the word just a few times. Can we talk a bit about just and justice and how do you hold that frame? Like, what's that mean to you, transitioning into a just world?
It's I don't know if I know the answer, right? It's not a world that is gender blind or age blind or color blind or language blind or faith blind. It's a lot more complex than it. But in a just world, we have a worldview that allows us to live within a complex world. And so it's a world that integrates the world around us. Right now, there's places where the world is very separated. And you look at what's going on in Israel, it's like there is a separation, even though these people share, a gene pool that goes back thousands of years. There's oppression happening there. It's complex. What would it mean to have the land of Palestine, Israel, Canaan? What would it be? What would it look like for it to be just? It's not dogmatic. I know you can't force people to have an idea of what justice is. Justice systems are set up by people that have biases. There's a certain way they see the world, and what feels just to them may not feel just to other people. I mean, the United States Constitution, which is an impressive legal document, was created with slavery in mind, right? That doesn't sound just to me. So it's complex. You know it when it's not there. The rate at which people of color are being murdered in this country, the fact that the global South is suffering from things that the global North infringed on it. We know that that's not just. How do you get to that place? I think it's like you have to rewire your brain almost. And I think the species is facing questions that it hasn't faced before. We're suddenly, with technology, with transportation, with fading of religion, I think that is affecting how we see what a just world might be. I think I know a little bit of what we can do to move towards a just world. Recognize where our responsibilities are. I think reparations is a way to think about justice, to think about how do we look at how we change how we see the world. Without going into like a utopian paradigm, I think I know the steps. I can't imagine what it looks like, but I think that we could together figure out what we need to cultivate today so that what will emerge will be a more just world. This is going to have to be, you think about testosterone, you think about skin color, you think about cultural norms, who in a community gets respected. There's so many different things that affect how one person, what seems just and others people don't. And how does one culture say this isn't just to you? So there is, if we go through this change, I think that might be the opportunity. Because some of the older system that created this capitalist, this hegemonic force that, we know what the attributes are, that once again, not clear. If those get challenged in a kind of fundamental way, something else will emerge. I don't know what it's going to look like. I have a sense that people feel safe, they have access to what they need, that maybe wealth is not what drives and motivates people. It's like, I don't want to go to, once again, like the utopian world. It's like, Star Trek is set in this world where nobody's hungry and there's no money and we're exploring space and the only problems with other species. I don't think that's necessarily how I can say, like, that's the bench post, but I think there are things we can do immediately in order to start setting the direction, trusting that what needs to show up will emerge. There's an element of mystery here. It's how Commonweal works. It's like, I don't know what's going to show up tomorrow. But there's a certain trust that if we do the right things, we cultivate the soil, the seeds that we're planting will emerge in a way that's just. And there's experiments, right? There's like, sometimes the ideas of justice are dogmatic. Like, you must behave this way, you must talk that way, which makes sense in some ways. And then other times you say, you know what? That may not be serving what we want to serve. Sometimes different sides of the political or religious spectrum mirror each other in their strategies. So it's complicated. If we looked at the world of how communities monitor themselves and create the norms that they need to, if we look how activists are able to raise things to the top, which may not be sustainable, and like we could actually shift there, but it's a good thing because they're giving us the benchmarks of the work that we need to do. It will take time to get there. So it's like, Christina Baldwin, who was one of the founders of Spirit Circle, I hope I got the name right, she says, proceed at the pace of guidance. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't fight, that there aren't activists that, lie down in front of the trucks that are driving fossil fuels to the plastic factory or stopping the police cars from going into low-income communities. Will it create the change at the pace that we want? I wish. But we do continue at the pace that feels right. It's trusting that the guidance is there. And there's a mystery there. There's a lot we don't understand.
Beautifully said, Oren. I really appreciate that. I want to also talk about money and philanthropy, which I know you are just coming out of a philanthropic gathering on the land there at Commonweal. We're both part of a network that tries to bring kind of donors and funders together in kind of radical, deep conversations. As an executive director of a nonprofit, you have to fundraise. And so, what has been the inquiries around money, the healing of money? How does this kind of all land for you in the conversation around philanthropy? And maybe we can dive into some sub-themes.
How much time
from there.
do we have?
Well, as long as you're willing to talk to me, I'm very much enjoying it, and hopefully someone's still watching.
Do you know Orland Bishop's work?
I do, but maybe help.
Oh God, you're not going to ask me to
contextualize that. Yeah. Channel Orland.
Yeah. Why don't we do a link to Orland's talk about
we'll
money?
link to Orland. Charles Eisenstein and
Right.
Orland have done a lot of work together. We'll link to some of those as well.
So it's the willing to understand money differently. Some people talk about money as something we agree upon that exists. If we all decide we don't believe in money, it's suddenly meaningless. Some people talk about money as a form of energy. Some people talk about money as a expression of capitalism. So there's different ways how you hold it. Sometimes when you're running a nonprofit, you're just like, I don't care what you call it, but we need to make this work happen, so I'll do what's needed to be done. And there are other times that it's like, we need this to happen, but we have certain ways of seeing the world that we have to stick to. So I feel like I'm saying everything is complex, but I think the nuance is actually what defines the difference. If it was nice if it was simple. Actually, I'm not sure that's true. It would make it boring. So I'm grateful for it is complex. So the ways we look at philanthropy and the way we look at money has a lot of different dimensions. And there's the systems of it, and then there's the cultural value that gets attributed to it. So it's like the fact that one is a wealthy person, what does that mean? Does it make them smarter? Do they know how to solve the world's problems? If one is successful in business, well, we know they were successful in business. Does that make them, will they know the design of the church that's supposed to go around the corner? So we do attribute to wealth certain qualities that are not inherent in the fact that one is wealthy. And of course, there's a difference between inherited wealth and wealth that one generates themselves. So we give a lot of meaning to money, especially in a capitalist system that celebrates it, right? Sometimes somebody who's successful is seen as a hero. I think it's part of the charm of some political leaders. Even someone like Donald Trump is like,
totally,
he's a success because he made a lot of money. He's like, you think when he wasn't willing to give out his taxes, like, is he hiding that because he will be less because he didn't make as much money? It turns out he did make a lot of money. But does that qualify him to be an opinion leader? And that's on both sides of the equation, right? There are definitely people that are very progressive that have lots of money. So we give certain attributes to that. And then when you're in the position of trying to channel resources to work that one considers important or good or necessary, it's like, how do you then tell the story? It's like, how do you develop relationships with sometimes people whose ego is invested in their money? Like, I sometimes wonder about, the person who made, let's say, a certain amount of money which exceeded their needs, right? So the additional resources that they're getting is not about having a secure retirement, or it's about secure retirement for their kids. There's a moment when you exceed that. I'm not sure what that number is. Is it 10 million or 10 billion? But what is the drive to keep accumulating more? Where does it come from? Like, what is the need? And then how do you approach someone like that to, like, the investment that you would make in this community organization would change the lives of thousands of people. But there's obviously an investment in it because you're still buying more and you're still accumulating more wealth. So there's this dynamic between these worlds that is reinforced by what we consider important, what our identity comes from. So when you look at philanthropy, it's a little bit of a mirror of that, right? So when a foundation feels like they need to represent the person who left them the money. It's like, okay, so Mr. Such and Such really cared about summer camps. So our role is to distribute the money to summer camps. So how do we make sure that the money goes to summer camps and they do their work well? So what we'll do is we'll ask the summer camp director to tell us about who they hire and how they decide on the program, and they will prove that the summer camp experience transforms young people's lives, and they have the diversity that reflects their community, and they provide access to people with low income. And each one of these is now a question on a form. So I think our form is about 12 pages long already.
Yeah, so it's both the grant application and the impact report, right?
Et cetera, with all the research to back it up. So when you tell me that, ropes course build confidence, how do you prove it?
Right. So these are also now the questions on the survey that goes to the kids after the camp, saying,
and the
did
parents
this transform
too,
and the parents and the school superintendent,
and follow up in 6 months to make sure that the learnings have stuck. So there's a certain, but what I'm doing is like, this person gave us money for summer camps and they wanted to make sure that the money works.
Totally.
So that creates a certain kind of dynamic. And when I was running a queer youth center, I was program director at Lyric, which is the LGBT youth center in San Francisco. I promised things to the city of San Francisco. I reduced suicide rates. I built healthy relationships between genders. I reduced HIV infection. I mean, let me tell you, I saved the world. Which some of it is true. The work that Lyric does still today, it does those things for sure. But the way that we promised it was really, you feel like you're distributing public money because you're the city of San Francisco. You want to hold organizations accountable. So you say, okay, well, tell me what you're going to do with our city money. Our citizens want to know. the work that I want to do is an after-school program drop-in. I want to do an art program. I want to do support group, and I want to do HIV prevention. It's like, okay, so you'll ask me to promise these things. I'll promise you those things. I'll tell you how many hours I work, and kind of between us, we'll be okay, right? Now, in the overall scheme of things, the city of San Francisco can look. We funded all these youth organizations, and look, HIV infections go down, and they did. Because of the education that these organizations and schools and health clinics, it actually did work. But what I promised, I just don't know. You know, I did not follow up on the young people. There's only so much you can do. We're in the day-to-day. So there's this kind of like, you know, you tell me what I want to hear. I'll tell you what you need to know, and we'll live in harmony. So, and that works. You know, there's a lot of organizations that it works for, even though you're feeling a little bit. And sometimes, you know, the funder was like, and I want you to do things this way. Right. So there's a challenging relationship that comes out of the fact that people are trying to do good work, but the way they understand it might be limiting how other people do good work. Right. I'm assuming there's no malicious intent. I'm taking that out of the equation. I'm just thinking that people have good intentions, and this is how they're trying to do it. So then you can ask, well, what are other ways one can do that?
Right.
What are creative ways how to do that? So if you're living in one neighborhood of Paris and you want to help people in the other neighborhood of Paris, the fact that you have the resources doesn't mean you understand what's happening over there. So maybe instead of me hiring people that can work with me, it's like, you know, I'll go to the local community leader and I'll say, you know what, here's a certain amount of money. You know this community. Why don't you distribute this based on what you know? My only request is that for it's the benefit of the community, and you don't use any of the money for yourself. So that's what's called flow funding. That's what Marion Weber invented in 1991. It's like, I don't know. I'm not part of that community. The fact that I have these resources are because I made it or I inherited it. It doesn't mean I know anything about this other neighborhood. How do you then channel the resources in a way that I'm not asking you for reports? I have trust.
Right.
And that, yeah.
So what I hear you saying, just to recap, is, you know, in this relationship between donors and organizations or causes or initiatives, there's some common shortcomings. And one of those is that people distributing the money may not be fully attuned to the needs and challenges of the community that they're seeking to serve. Another challenge is, of course, that because people, especially in kind of more of the intermediate administrative context of distributing funds, whether it's on behalf of a donor or government, they feel responsible for making sure things are accountable, transparent, tracked, measured, but that can actually result in all these downstream burdens and kind of unintended consequences on, again, the organizations that they serve. And you're describing what seems to be an emergent, you know, term being used and tossed around in philanthropy, coined also by Marion Weber, or at least embodied and started.
Flow funding?
Flow funding.
Flow funding was coined by Marianne, and she has a website about it. She has a poem about it.
Oh, beautiful.
She definitely is the foremother of that idea. Trust-based philanthropy, I'm not sure where it emerged from, but it's within the same context, which is that I will trust you to do the right thing. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to trust your expertise. I'm going to trust your passion. I'm going to trust your commission. I'm going to trust your lineage, which requires a relationship, right? And so like if you have a relationship with a community that you want to support, there may be a moment where you can say, you know, as if I am the person with resources, like, I trust you to do the right thing. I'm not going to ask you to apply for this grant every year. We'll agree for 3 years. And there won't be strings attached. And at the end, tell me what happened. You know, send me a video. And there's that's really what's calling me right now. Is kind of that kind of trust, because the relationship in a community between the community itself, its institutions, its stakeholders, its faith leaders, its whatever form of leadership there is and the people that have access to resources. If there is trust in there, I think that's what resilience comes from.
Right.
And part of that network is like trusting the community to do the right thing. There will be people that will take it to their own advantage. There will be people who will take risks and they won't pan out. But when the trust is there, I think you're going to more likely be able to realize what a community needs better than saying, I want to hold you accountable to what a donor who's no longer with us wants, or I want you to hold accountable to what I think is right. And then it makes the whole process of how the funding happens different, right? There are people that are really good at like asking for funding. You know, they know how to put people in there. You can take workshops in this and like, how do you do fundraising and how do you ask people? Sometimes people think that Commonweal has money. We're a nonprofit. We don't. I mean, we have the resources we need. So I get pitched and I'm like, you are a master at what you do. I'm sorry I don't have the resources to help you.
Right.
But if there's a relationship, it changes it, right?
Yeah.
Imagine I wanted to ask you for something now. So like we do have a relationship that precedes this interview. I would just be straightforward and we could do it in a deep and real way. And I wouldn't be playing game. And, you know, you have, I don't know what your narrative is, but we'd be able to have this in a way that is, I hope, trusting and that is relational. And I think that starts to take the sting out of philanthropy. You know, and when you add on top of it that sometimes the funds that fund philanthropy come from extractive systems, right? It's a way to repatriate ownership. It may not be by giving the oil field, because that was my great-grandfather, but it's a way of like, you know, what was taken out of the ground belongs to everybody. Land isn't owned, neither are the minerals underneath it. So if we made a living out of it, I think there's a responsibility for those of us in subsequent generations to ask these questions. I can't tell one what to do, but we do need to ask that question. So what does it mean to have a trusting relationship? What does it mean to have relational fundraising? What does it mean to have participatory grant making?
Yeah, that last thread around repatriation reminds me of the work of Alnor Lada and Lynn Murphy with post-capitalist philanthropy, and they talk about redemption. And I see that there's a community called Resource Generation that has some, I guess, prominence in this field of young people or younger people, often of inherited wealth, trying to make sense of how to be in right relationship in this moment with the resources they have. And a lot of the conversational tone that I've experienced is like a real reckoning of, okay, what was the behavior of my ancestors? How was this wealth generated? And then what is my opportunity or responsibility, however it's being held, you know, in response to that. I think too, just a few of the themes you touched on, like for me, this, you know, trust-based is such an interesting, you know, trust-based. It reminds me of like the term nature-based, where I'm like, isn't it all nature, you know, at some level?
You would hope.
You would hope. But like the way it showed up in our philanthropic expression, and we've been in this examination and inquiry for some time in our own small way, was really anchoring to the word gift rather than grant, because we felt like gifting embodied that trust more. Like if you go give your family member a gift, it's not like you put a bunch of, you know, here you go, unwrap the present, but only if you do this and this.
You should meet my parents.
And after you're done using the gift, tell me, you know, exactly. It's like, no, it's like, I give this to you. And I've also, you know, having now gone through different scales of capital in philanthropy, have an appreciation for it's complicated. You know, because there's certainly times and moments where you need to have more accountability given the organization or the project and its stage and its maturity, or there's times when the foundation that's granting or gifting the money is in a good position to support with other, you know, value added time, introduction, services, governance, and so forth. And then there's a lot of times where I think, write the check for $5,000 and get out of the way. Just trust the executive director and the nonprofit, and ideally make it a multi-year commitment. And absolutely don't put all of those extra strings. I think another area where there can be a bit more nuanced conversation about this difference between impact reporting, measurements, accountability versus like trust and like let's just let the organization do its thing, is really just to frame it as feedback loops in that relationship. Because what I'm noticing from donors I speak with is that there's a very unsatisfying pattern of experience where you give an organization money and then you don't really ever hear from them again.
Right.
Or you only hear from them when it's time to get more money.
Right.
And I think it's both kind of like that kind of just sucks to be on the other side of that, because there's a feeling of being commodified or
being used.
Being used. And you don't really know, like, how are things going? And it becomes like this black hole, and the money was often, difficult to earn, right? And so it just kind of is like, hey, that's my money,
right,
and I gave it to you. Like, what's the reciprocity of relationship here?
I think relationship is the key word.
Exactly.
Right. If it's a transactional relationship from either side, then it's going to be transactional. And transactional by nature doesn't have the soul, doesn't have the connection. There are humans on either side. There's disparities, there's power differences, there's different stories, there's different lineages, there's different goals, but there are humans on either side, and a relationship takes two humans. So trust has to go both ways. You trust me and I'll trust you. And part of it is relationship. And when that relationship is in place, then you will have ongoing communication. It may not be every day, right? There's a difference between I'll update you once a month versus, let's talk when you're in the neighborhood. You'll call me, I'll call you when I'm. It's like a relationship and recognizing it as such. And it's tricky because if you're the person who has the resources, it's like, are they my friend because I am wealthy, or are they my friend because they care about me, or are they not my friend, right? It's like, that's a hard place to be in.
Totally.
I know some people that are really, it's a challenge. They don't know who to trust.
Yeah.
Especially if you're mega wealthy, it's like, who do you trust?
Yeah.
So it goes both ways. It has to be an authentic relationship. And that's where, what does it take to recognize authenticity? What does it mean to be in relationship? Like, if you're in a relationship with your partner that's transactional, it's probably not going to be a happy marriage. We only get together when we're, I don't know, whatever reason there'd be to be in a relationship. It's not going to work. And so it has to be a real relationship. Now, are there complexities to that? It might be even harder. How do you negotiate a relationship in which there's a difference in power and wealth and so on? But if it's a relationship and it's authentic, then you can do that.
Yeah.
So many of the people that support Commonweal do that for that reason. And they're different, and there's a variety of it, but there won't be trust if there's not a connection. Trusting someone just because they fit a specific story or they do work that seems good, that's not enough to create that. In that case, maybe there's some other ways to make the relationship more transactional that doesn't impose too much on the grantee, but at the same time also recognize what the gifter is doing.
Yeah. Okay. So we have this terminology, trust-based philanthropy, to describe this, and this term from Merriam-Webber, flow funding. And flow funding, I guess, explicitly is when a philanthropist or donor or foundation, whomever, gives the resources to someone else and says, okay, you distribute them,
right,
whether it's in that particular community or your particular field of expertise. And then you alluded to participatory philanthropy. What is that?
So all of these different terms are not exact, and there's variations and there's overlap between them. So participatory philanthropy, my understanding of it, is that when the community that is going to be the beneficiary of the resources are the ones that are going to make a decision about it. It's like participatory budgeting. Like San Francisco has this big community organization that creates a city budget. They're not a formal city entity. I think the city has its own way of doing it, but there's a community organization that says, here's how we want to allocate the resources of the city of San Francisco. And, hopefully people are listening and taking that work and getting insight from it. So that's a participatory program where you have community leaders or community members, depending what the scale that you're working on, that are engaging in how that happens. Mm-hmm. So we have a program called ORA. Stands for Omega Resilience Awards. And what we're trying to do and how we're looking at the polycrisis is to magnify the voices from the global south, which are getting lost in the polycrisis, which is happening in the global north. So we were trying to figure out how do we do that in a participatory way that it won't be an organization in the Bay Area saying, you people do this and send me your reports at the end. Mm-hmm. So the process that we ended up developing, and nothing is perfect, but this is an interesting experiment, was that we identified hubs in 3 countries, in Argentina, Nigeria, and India. And we told those hubs, here's what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. What we can do is we can give the organization itself a grant and then also give funding, and you find people in your communities in any way you want to that will then receive these, and then you'll be the ones that are in communication with them. So each one of the hubs decided in a different way, but a few of them set up like community members that came together and they spread the word whatever way they did. And those community members went through the process of sifting through from 300 applications to 7 applications. Mm-hmm. So that's a form of participatory philanthropy where, we're an intermediary. The funder is the Oak Foundation. We're making this happen, but without attaching strings to how it happened, so that the people in the Argentinian organization is making the decisions of how to do it in South America. And the organization in Nigeria, Home F, they're making the decisions about that. And the organization in India is making their own decisions. So it's a form of having participation from the community. And what this does, it kind of decolonizes wealth. Mm-hmm. So the person who was the original person who accumulated the wealth is not dictating, how the wealth is actually used, but really allowed to fulfill a shared mission. And these organizations wouldn't be joining if they weren't asking questions around the polycrisis and the voice of the global south. But to do it in a way that doesn't come with the old model of like, mm-hmm. I know, and here's what I want you to do, which comes probably from good intentions. There is the, I did terrible things and I'm going to cover up with it by giving the money away. There is that. Mm-hmm. But, once again, coming back, that let's assume that these are people that come from faith traditions that, Christianity wants people to give funds away. It's in all the religions. It's right. About sharing. So, I don't want to dismiss that out of malice, but there is power dynamics. So we're trying to, participatory budgeting, trust-based philanthropy, flow funding are all ways to decolonize wealth in their own way. And once again, this is at the pace of guidance. We're not there yet. We're moving there, right? Mm-hmm. Often these organizations are led. Sometimes it's by the wealth holder, but also it's sometimes by friends of theirs. So they're still within the privileged communities. There's a gradual shift. You're seeing more BIPOC leaders at foundations. This is a process that is happening. And that changes the relationship. That changes the questions. That changes the level of transactionness. That word of how transaction something is, right? Yeah. It changes that dynamic to allow for the community itself to take responsibility. And the truth is, you may, if a community has a drought, it doesn't mean that someone from the community knows how to start a desalination plant. Right. They're going to have to bring in an expert from the outside, but they know that they need water. So there's a way to kind of tap into expertise, tap into people that have experience in something that the community itself may not know how to do, but the community should be part of it. Right. Right. It's like, I'm not going to go to a community that has no water and say, I'm going to give you a desal plant because that's going to solve your problem. It might be true, but in participatory processing, either budgeting or philanthropy, you'd have the community participate as well.
Yeah, I like it. It's yet another one of those ingredients for hopefulness in this moment in time. Really appreciating this conversation with you, Oren, and how much time you've shared. Are there other threads, themes, pontifications that you would like to leave us with, or anything I didn't ask?
Please don't tell me that I pontificate. No, I mean, there's many more conversations that we could be having and probably will have opened over the years. And there are moments when we can share with others and moments that we're not. Every time has its place, and I think we've covered a lot today, and I'm grateful, and I'm sure there's things that we've reflected on that I'll be like, I can't believe I said that, and there'll be things that surprise, like, it's like... sitting with Orland a few weeks ago, Orland Bishop, who's kind of this teacher, community leader, amazing communicator, shaman, he said, sometimes I don't understand what I say, which was deeply validating, and I will own that. Sometimes in these conversations, especially with people that you're comfortable with and care about, new things emerge. So I think we covered a lot for today, and I trust that what had need to be said was said.
Yes. How do people visit or plug into this wonderful world of Commonweal?
Wouldn't it be ironic if I made a pitch for funding for Commonweal right now?
Donate now, $20, and it gets matched.
Operators online, co-operators, to quote Caroline Casey. I would encourage to explore a lot of these threads. We started a lot of threads, the one that resonate, whether it's Nuns and Nuns or the Retreat Center Collaborative or the work that you're doing, or, there's a lot of things. Commonweal could be among them. We're trying to explore, how do we tell our story? Sometimes it feels like our story is like, we happen to have this cast in this specific place, so it's kind of circumstantial. But there's more to the narrative there. And I think that we do have a responsibility to share some of the learnings that we had. We don't have all the answers. We are, as Michael says, we're radically imperfect. I know that for a fact. I know how many times I've messed up. But there is a story to be told that some of it can be found in like conventional website and so on. If people are interested in different forms of philanthropy, there's some amazing organizations out there that are doing good work. There are people at Commonweal that could answer that. We have our Resilience Funders Network, which is a group of funders that are working on the questions of resilience. So it's one of those diverse rabbit holes. If you want to start with Commonweal, Commonweal comes from the word commonwealth. So the benefit of the community, so without the TH. So on our website, which is commonweal.org, there's kind of an entry that then will lead to different program sites and so on. I'm not going to make a pitch for funding because I'll make a pitch for relationship. So if you find the story of Commonweal, either with one of our program directors, with our stewardship circle, come for a visit. Commonweal is beautiful right now with all the wildflowers. It's stunning. Come for a walk. And I find that those walks are where you drop into what you really are, because you can leave the city energy behind. You can leave some of the narrative. We obviously carry our stories with us. But there's something a lot of walking along the cliffs over the Pacific where the horizon is the ocean, which it feels like you're suddenly in the presence of something that is beyond us. Call it mystery, call it divine, call it nature, that you can drop into a unique story from a new perspective. And on those walks, I find that's where the connection happens. And I think that's the most important thing. If it's a teenager who's at our youth climate activist camp, if it's a person living with cancer, if it's a physician who's asking about their role as a healer, that land holds transformation. So if people are looking for connection, it might be a good place to start. And there's amazing pieces of land just like that all over.
Yeah, I've done the walk twice now.
and I would attest to it's one of those pieces of land where I don't have my finger on the words, but you're in a different place.
Yeah.
Something else energetically is happening, and I hope to spend more quality time there, but would definitely encourage, especially anyone in the Bay Area, if they get an opportunity to come visit. I think too, just the wisdom that you hold, if I may say that, as well as the organization, Michael Lerner, and the team that surrounds you in the community, I think it's pertinent for everyone in this moment. The inquiries that you're holding around polycrisis and death and like healing is like it's universal. But I also am particularly hoping that people who might come from some of my generation's entrepreneurial Web3 spirit, starting new organizational forms or thinking about incentive structures and different ways of organizing, draw upon some of the lessons and patterns and kind of think deeply, because there have been lots of experiments and lots of learnings that can be drawn from the footsteps that you've all laid and continue to put forward. So thank you, Oren, so much for doing this, for the work that you do in the world, and looking forward to being on the journey with you.
Amen. Thank you.
Cheers.
To learn more about Commonweal, go to commonweal.org, where you can also make a donation. There's a link in the show notes. To continue this discussion, come join us in our community Discord. You can find those links and more at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.